The static of the forest. It started with a camping trip, a group of friends looking to disconnect from the pressures of their digital lives. Emily, Matt, Jordan, and Claire set up their tents deep within the Whispering Pines National Park, an untouched wilderness far from cell towers and Wi-Fi signals. The group had always joked about getting off the grid, but none of them were prepared for how far the forest would take them. The first night, the air buzzed with excitement as they told ghost stories around the fire. Matt laughed off every spooky tale, proclaiming himself a skeptic. But his bravado faltered when Emily noticed an odd noise. A faint, low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Probably just a generator somewhere, Matt shrugged. There's no power out here, Jordan reminded him, her voice uneasy. The sound persisted, growing louder as the hours ticked by. When they finally retired to their tents, sleep proved elusive. The hum was accompanied by faint static, as if a radio were trying to tune into a station that didn't exist. By the second day, the noise had evolved into a had grown louder when they were near certain trees. Massive, ancient pines whose bark seemed almost metallic under the sunlight. Jordan, usually the most level-headed, began snapping at the others, claiming the sound was drilling into her skull. Claire tried to laugh it off, but her nervous glances betrayed her unease. That night, the sound became unbearable. It wasn't just a hum or a whine anymore. It was layered, disjointed voices speaking in tones no human could replicate. The forest, alive with whispers, seemed to be watching. Around midnight, Matt bolted upright in his tent. "Did you hear that?" he hissed, his breath coming in short gasps. "Hear what?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Footsteps. Outside, the group gathered near the fire pit, flashlights trembling in their hands. The footsteps grew louder, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. Emily shone her flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice wavering. A shape appeared between the trees, vaguely human but wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head cocked to the side as if studying them. The figure flickered, like a bad signal on an old TV. "Run!" Jordan screamed, breaking the trance. They sprinted through the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The static followed, growing louder, the voices now shrieking incomprehensible phrases. Emily stumbled, her hand brushing against one of the metallic pines. A shock coursed through her body, and for a moment, she saw someone, trapped inside the tree. Their face was twisted in agony, their mouth open in a silent scream. "We have to get out of here," she gasped, pulling herself up. When they reached the edge of the forest, the noise stopped abruptly. Turning back, they saw nothing but trees, silent and unyielding. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the horror they'd witnessed. They never spoke of it again, but Emily couldn't forget the image of the face in the tree. Months later, she read a news article about unexplained disappearances in Whispering Pines. Each case mentioned the same detail. The victims' phones were found on the forest floor, locked on screens full of static. The last bus stop, it was just another late shift for Laura. She worked as a nurse at the county hospital, often pulling double shifts to cover for understaffed nights. By the time she clocked out, the city had long since gone to sleep. She stood at the bus stop, tired and alone, the yellow light of the street lamp casting eerie shadows across the deserted road. Her phone buzzed, a text from her roommate reminding her to lock the door when she got home. She barely had the energy to reply. The bus was late, as usual, but this time it was different. The air felt heavier, and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, seeing nothing but the empty street and a line of closed storefronts. Still, the sensation persisted. Finally, the bus appeared, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the city. It screeched to a halt, the doors hissing open. Laura stepped on, nodding briefly at the driver, who didn't return the gesture. The interior of the bus was dimly lit, the seats mostly empty except for a man sitting near the middle. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. Laura sat a few rows behind him, keeping her distance but unable to resist glancing at him every so often. The ride was uneventful at first, the bus trundling through quiet streets. Laura noticed that it wasn't stopping at any of the usual stops. She leaned forward. "Excuse me," she called to the driver. "I think you missed my stop." The driver didn't respond. He sat rigidly, his hands gripping the wheel. The man in the hat turned his head slightly, and Laura froze. His face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth expanse of pale skin, devoid of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. She stifled a scream and quickly looked away. The bus picked up speed, the city blurring into an unfamiliar, desolate landscape. Laura stood and stumbled toward the driver. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The driver turned to face her, and she saw that he, too, was faceless. Laura staggered back, her heart pounding as the bus came to a sudden stop. The doors opened onto a stretch of barren land, lit by an unearthly green glow. The man in the hat stood and walked off the bus, disappearing into the mist. Laura hesitated, but when the driver turned toward her again, she had no choice but to follow. The air outside was cold and damp, and the ground beneath her feet felt strangely soft, like walking on flesh. A low humming filled the air, growing louder with every step. Ahead, she saw a circle of figures, all wearing dark coats and wide-brimmed hats, their faceless heads tilted toward the sky. Laura felt a pull, an invisible force drawing her into the circle. She screamed, trying to fight it, but her body moved against her will. The figures turned to face her, and for a moment, everything went silent. When she woke, she was back at the bus stop. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her roommate, the same one as before. The street looked the same, the light of the street lamp unchanged. But something felt wrong. Her reflection in the bus shelter's glass stared back at her, expressionless. She raised a hand to her face and felt nothing but smooth, featureless skin. The forgotten lake. Every summer, the quaint lakeside town of Crystal Hollow attracted families, campers, and anglers. The locals, however, always whispered about the southern shore, a secluded area with dark waters and overgrown reeds. They called it the Forgotten Lake, and no one who lived in Crystal Hollow dared venture there after sunset. Aaron, a city photographer, scoffed at such superstitions. He had rented a cabin on the northern shore for a week of solitude and inspiration. On his second day, he decided to hike around the lake, hoping to capture untouched natural beauty. The southern shore intrigued him. The dense fog that hung over the water and the ancient willow trees leaning eerily toward the lake begged to be photographed. As Aaron reached the forbidden side, the temperature seemed to drop. His camera lens fogged up, and he could barely make out the water through the mist. But there was movement. A ripple disturbed the glassy surface, though there was no wind and no sound of fish or birds. He knelt near the shore, his camera poised, when he saw it. A small hand breaking the surface of the water. It was pale and slender, reaching up as if begging for help. Without thinking, Aaron dropped his camera and lunged forward, grasping the hand. But it wasn't solid. It dissolved into water the moment he touched it. Heart pounding, Aaron stumbled back. He told himself it was a trick of the light, the fog playing games with his mind. Yet, as he looked around, he noticed faint impressions on the muddy shore. Small, barefoot prints leading into the water but not out. That night, back at his cabin, Aaron couldn't sleep. He edited his photos only to discover something chilling. In every image of the southern shore, he saw faint shapes. Children standing ankle-deep in the lake, their faces blurred, their eyes hollow. The whispers began the next night. He was sitting on the cabin's porch when he heard them. Soft voices carried by the breeze. "Come back," they seemed to say. "Help us." Unable to resist, Aaron grabbed his flashlight and camera and made his way back to the southern shore. The whispers grew louder, and the fog seemed to part for him, revealing the lake in an unnatural, glowing clarity. The surface rippled again, and this time, he saw them clearly, children, their heads just above the water, their arms outstretched. "Who are you?" Aaron asked, his voice shaking. "We were forgotten," one of them replied, their voice like the rustle of leaves. "Will you stay with us?" Aaron felt the pull, his feet moving of their own accord toward the water. He tried to resist, but the children's voices grew louder, pleading and desperate. He stepped into the lake, the icy water biting at his legs. He couldn't stop. The next morning, hikers found Aaron's camera on the shore, its memory card filled with haunting images of children staring out from beneath the water. His body was never recovered, but the locals added his name to the growing list of those who vanished at the forgotten lake. The Red Room. When Alyssa moved into her new apartment, she thought she had found a hidden gem. It was on the top floor of an old building downtown, with tall windows that bathed the rooms in natural light. The rent was suspiciously low, but Alyssa chalked it up to the building's age and the city's struggling housing market. The only odd feature was the small, windowless room at the end of the hallway. The landlord had warned her it was locked and shouldn't be opened. "It's just storage for old pipes and wiring," he explained, avoiding her gaze. Alyssa didn't think much of it at first. The apartment was perfect otherwise, and she settled in quickly. But within the first week, strange things began to happen. The locked room would occasionally emit faint sounds, soft tapping, like knuckles on wood, and sometimes a faint scraping, as if something heavy were being dragged across the floor. One night, as she was preparing for bed, Alyssa noticed something strange. The hallway light flickered, and she felt an odd draft despite all the windows being closed. She turned toward the locked door and saw it. Red light seeping through the crack at the bottom, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. Her curiosity got the better of her. She called the landlord the next day, asking about the room again. "It's nothing," he said tersely. "Leave it alone." But she couldn't. Over the next few nights, the noises grew louder, footsteps pacing back and forth, and whispers so faint she couldn't make out the words. The red light grew brighter, spilling into the hallway like a warning. On the fourth night, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a screwdriver and began working on the lock. Took longer than she expected, but eventually the latch gave way. The door creaked open, revealing the room inside. It was empty, except for the walls, which were covered in dark red stains that looked like they had soaked into the plaster. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic tang. Alyssa stepped inside cautiously, her phone's flashlight illuminating strange markings carved into the floor. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. The red light intensified, casting shadows that twisted and moved unnaturally. The whispers returned, louder and angrier. They came from all around her, voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage and despair. She ran to the door, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. Her phone's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. The whispers turned into screams, and Alyssa felt something cold and sharp brush against her arm. Then silence. Days later, the landlord arrived after complaints from neighbors about a foul smell. The apartment was empty, save for Alyssa's belongings. The door to the red room was sealed shut, and when the landlord tried to open it, he found the lock intact, as if it had never been tampered with. He didn't call the police. He simply put the apartment back on the market. Someone new would move in soon, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions.